Hello everyone, welcome back to another video in our Spring Security with Angular tutorial series. In this video we are going to be talking about JPA repository and how we can use it to load our users that we use to log into our application from the database instead of from in-memory. So as you may know, in our current user service we use the user in-memory repository, and the in-memory repository stores two users in a hash map that we use to log in. Basically want to do exactly the same thing, but now just from the database. And in this video we are going to demonstrate how we can use that. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to go to our build Gradle inside of the modules backend, and we want to add the dependency to the Spring Boot starter data JPA. Once we have done that, this Gradle pop-up will show up, which you can use to refresh or reload the Gradle dependencies, or you can just click here and reload them, and this will download the needed dependencies. We need this one so that we are able to create our entity and our repository. Okay, and the next thing that we want to do is we want to move on to our application properties. Again, in the backend module, there should be the resources folder, and inside of it application properties file, or if you don't have it, just create it. And you need these properties. You need the data source URL, which just points to the schema that you want to use. And I have created one named Spring Security. You can name it whatever you want, it doesn't really matter. So as long as the name matches whatever you have, whatever you have created. Then you have your data source username and password, and also the dialect that we are going to be using. And you need these two properties to be able to create the entities once your application starts. Okay, if you have settled that, the next thing that we want to do is you want to create your user entity. So the entity or the table definition that you will have in your database. So let's do that really fast. Let's close these two files. Let's go to the user package, and inside of it, let's create a new Java class and name it user entity. This user entity class will be annotated with @entity annotation. And we are going to have a couple of properties here. We're going to have an ID, and we're going to have a username and password. So let me just add them really fast. And here they are. So we have our entity class with an ID, which is of type long, and then we have the username and password, and both columns are not nullable, so there can't be null. And yeah, so once we have our user entity, we want to create our repository. So inside of the user package, again, we create a new interface and we name it user repository. So this user repository will be extending the JPA repository. And here we pass in two types. So the type of our entity, which is the user entity, and the type of the ID of the user entity, which is long. And of course, we annotate it with @repository. Once we have done this, we can move into our current user service. And inside of the current user service, let me just get rid of these imports. Inside of the current user service, we have our user in-memory repository, and we have this load user by username method. Now we need to implement something similar in our user repository, so the new one that we added. So let's just add a method called, so this method will return a user entity, and it will be named FindBy username. And to this method we pass in the username, so the string. The Spring actually does a really amazing thing here. If you just specify this FindBy username, it can actually implement it on its own, so you don't have to do anything. It will actually create you a query that will find this user entity by the username. So there is a property called username inside of the entity, and FindBy will just use that property to find it by whatever the value you have passed in. So you should have the same name here, so username, and then here also username. Okay, so next thing that we want to do is we want to add our user repository. So let's duplicate this, let's remove this, and we have user repository here, and we want to rename this one to in memory repository so that we can tell them apart. Select, yeah. And this one is the user repository, and we want to add it to the constructor. So we want to inject it to our current user service. And in the real application, in the production, you would not have something like in-memory repository, so you would get rid of this code. But for sake of this tutorial, I'm going to keep it. And what we are going to do is we're going to try to load the user by the repository. If that doesn't work, then we're going to use the in-memory repository. So let's try it. So let's go repository.findBy username, and you're going to pass in the username that's passed to this method. This returns a user entity, so we can name it like that. We can just name it user, and then we're going to add some checks. So if user is not null, we are going to convert it to the current user. So let's create a new instance of the current user class, and let's current user.set username, which we're going to get from the user, so the user entity, get username, and we're going to do the same with the password. So set password, and here we're going to have get password, and then we are just going to return the current user that we just created here. So I can make this final, and yeah, that should be it. Basically what we do here is we try to load it, so we can also make this final. We try to load it from the database using our repository, and if that doesn't work, we then if that does work, we create the current user from the user entity and return it. And if it doesn't work, we go to the in-memory repository and then try to load it. And if it in-memory doesn't work, you would throw an exception. In the real application, you would just throw an exception. So this exception in this part here, if you don't have this user, you wouldn't try something like this. But I leave it here just for the sake of the tutorial. Okay, so once we have this, you should start your application. And once you have started it for the first time, if you go to your database, not sure if you can see this, this is quite small, but I just can't make it any bigger, and I don't know how actually. So in the Spring Security schema that I created, you will get the user entity table. So if I refresh this, nothing should change. And in the user entity, you would insert with an ID 0 password, this encoded one, and the username user1. The encoded password you can get from the in-memory repository. We have implemented this in one of the previous tutorials, so you can just copy this string and paste it in your database. Once you have this, your application should be ready to go. So you can either start your front end if you have it and use it, or you can just go with Postman and try to execute some requests and see how our application works. So if we try to log in with a user with the user name user1 and password user1, we should be able to log in. So we should get this session ID. We get the session ID back. If we try with user2, this should also work because we have user2 in our in-memory repository. As you can see, it does work. And if we try with user3 and some password, whatever, this should not work because we don't have this one, so it's unauthorized. So let's try this again with some breakpoints. Let's put a breakpoint in our current user service and see what happens. So I'll just put one here and then we can just iterate through it. Let's call this. So we end up at our breakpoint, and as you can see, we are trying to load it from the database. It says here user is not null, so this is true. We enter here, and then we create a current user instance and go through this. But if I go to Postman and change this to user2, so user2 is the one that's still in memory, we send this, and then as you can see here, this is false now because we didn't find it in the database. But we go here to the in-memory one. As you can see, current user is not null, so current user does exist with some username and password, and we return it here and everything works. Yeah, that's everything for this tutorial. It was actually quite simple. Hopefully you understand what we did here, and if something is unclear, do let me know and I will try to explain it. Thank you for sticking with this tutorial. If you like it, consider subscribing to the channel for more exciting tutorials to come. And I guess I will see you in the next one.